Is your first women's sports hero actually an actress? Hear me out. Millennials might not have grown up in the women's sports boom, but we grew up in the women's sports movie boom. I'm really thrilled that this already sounds like an antiquated fun fact, but kids who grew up around the turn of the century usually couldn't watch women's sports on TV. For the most part, there was no tuning in on ESPN and seeing a women's sports hero. Kids today wouldn't understand. But that doesn't mean we didn't have women's sports heroes on TV. They were just the leads of some of our favorite movies. When you think about it, these movies stood in the gap where sports media was failing audiences. As an adult and a sports journalist myself, I'm flabbergasted when I think about how a film like Bend It Like Beckham, which was a smash hit, did include decision makers into the fact that there was a massively underserved audience of people wanting to see women's sports. The film cost like $6 million to make, and it pulled in about $76.6 million worldwide. I don't know how sports execs at that time looked at those numbers and thought, nah, no one's interested in women's sports. And just to give you an idea of how strong the headwinds have been getting more women's sports content out there, that film came out in 2002. And about 20 years later, in 2023, Wasserman's research found just 15% of total sports coverage was devoted to women's sports. And at that time, all of us women's sports journalists were all really excited about that because that meant it was up from the dreaded 4% mark it had sat at for forever. Look, I'm not saying there weren't women's sports stars in that era. Of course. We had Venus and Serena, we had Mia Hamm, we had Lisa Leslie. But where sports media failed audiences, these movies laid the groundwork. They normalized the idea that girls could be the lead in a sports story. That's why it doesn't surprise me that millennials are showing up for women's sports now. We've always cared. Before, we were limited to watching and rewatching the same VHS tapes. Now, we actually get to catch the action live.